Welcome back to the PolicyViz Podcast. I'm your host once again, John Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, we switch gears and talk about data and storytelling, not on computers, but in the real world. And so I'm excited to have on the show as my guest, Braden Crooks from Undesign the who created this project called Undesign the Redline, which I discovered in Washington, D.C. in late 2024. Found it really inspiring, a really great use of data, of storytelling in the physical real world, and also participation where as you're reading the exhibit, you get to actually write on little cards and provide your stories and your perspective and your information to the exhibit as well. And so this exhibit's been around for about a decade. Braden and his team have taken it around across the country in a variety of different areas and different ways that they've exhibited it and worked with communities and worked with localities. So if you are someone kind of like me, like kind of hidden behind the computer a little bit, working with your quantitative data, doing your analysis, but want to have an impact, want to get your stuff out into the world, have localities use it, communities use it, and see that impact, I think this will be the episode of the podcast for you. So with that in mind, and before we get to the actual interview, let me just ask you once again, if you take a moment and can just rate and review the show on your favorite podcast provider's platform, I would greatly appreciate it. It does help me bring in more guests. It does help more people learn about the exciting world of data visualization and data communication. Okay, that's my ask. Let's move on to this week's episode of the show. Here's my conversation with Braden Crooks from Undesign the Hey, Braden, good to see you again. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. We met late last year in DC, where I came across your Undesign the Redline project, which we're going to talk about in detail, and was just fascinated about it. And I'm excited to learn more about the work you and your team do at Designing the So maybe we could start with your background a little bit, and then your team and how this Redline project came to be.
Yeah, sure. Well, my career, I actually started out in landscape architecture and kind of this design background. And shortly after getting my undergraduate degree in landscape architecture, I got into environmental advocacy. So I was doing that, and, we were talking a lot about not just, this was in Pennsylvania. So there was anti-fracking movement, there was a bunch of different movements, but I was particularly interested in kind of, we want these local, thriving, sustainable places where, we can really all come together. And I wanted to focus more on that. And it brought me to New York. And that's where my co-founder and I met, was actually at Parsons, in a really interesting program. It's a design program, but it's a master's of science. It's called Design and Urban Ecologies. And so it's a social sciences program, but it integrates a lot of the designers coming from the design profession, as well as social scientists, people coming from that space, and kind of intermingles that. And, I think that that's developed for me a really unique perspective and kind of set of skills.
Yeah.
And it led directly to the work with Undesign the Redline, and both unpacking the history of redlining, but really doing it in a way that is thoughtful about the outcomes and really affecting change. I think about, I had a mentor and professor, Dr. Mindy Foley Love, whose work is really seminal in the space. If you haven't read the book, for example, Root Shock, which she, I think, just hit 20 years, really important book about not only redlining, but forced displacement and effects of urban policy on people's lives and health. But one of the things that we talked about, and she introduced to me, was the idea of what we call situation analysis. And it's just an approach towards looking at these things that leads to understand the situation, situation, and create clarity around that.
Right.
And the situation leading you into what to do. I mean, if you understand the key measure of whether or not you understand the situation of of a place or as an event is that it tells you a bit what you need to do about it.
Mm.
And so that was always a big piece of when we're telling the story of redlining, when we're telling the story of urban policy, that at the end you get a sense of, well, what do we need to do that comes out of that story?
Right.
And that's a little different, I think, than a lot of researchers and social scientists who are very focused kind of on the trees and a little bit less the forest in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And the project we'll talk about in detail in a moment, I think tries to get to that sort of forest part for people who
Hmm.
are maybe not as familiar with the details of redlining and the impacts of redlining around the country. I want to talk about the project obviously in detail in a moment, but so you and your partner come together, your co-partner, and so they have a background in design. You have a background in landscape architecture. How do you and others, I would guess, work together and sort of on the data side, on the storytelling side, on the design side? I mean, how do all those pieces sort of fall into place?
Well, we had been doing this as our graduate school research for years, and
Mm.
then very quickly, actually, we were invited to bring it into an exhibit format,
Ah,
and
okay.
in took all this years of work and then kind of distilled it
Yeah.
pretty quickly. I mean, we had been doing I had been doing some work around timelines
Hmm.
and really thinking through sort of a pedagogical approach towards creating a timeline that is less focused on dates and kind of this very linear
Yeah.
or kind of bop bop bop. I don't
Right.
know,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
rhythm of a timeline, which
Yeah.
to doing something that's more about the flows of how one thing affects the next and how one
Hmm.
thing leads to another,
Right.
less concerned about are the things arranged exactly date by date, or are the
Yeah.
things arranged in such a way that you get a sense of how people are reacting, how are people responding to an event, and then that leading to the next era, that leading to the next set of events. And
Right.
that follows through with the policy. Often the policy is sort of responding to the crises in the moment without necessarily zooming out to say, how is this part of a much deeper history?
Yeah.
And for that reason, a lot of the things, one of the key lessons that comes out of our timeline and really looking at this history in general is a lot of the crises of one era come out of what are quote unquote solutions of an era prior.
Mm.
And that storytelling of kind of that movement forward and that flow forward, as opposed to the dots, more like the lines between the dots, connecting
Yeah.
the dots, is the key piece, I think, in making it compelling.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A kind of different way to think about time, right? Like you have a busy week this week, and next week is kind of a slow, quiet week.
Hmm.
They're equally spaced, but the work is
Yeah.
very different those 2 weeks. Yeah. Um, so I'll put links to the project on your site on the show notes so people can take a look. But for those who are just listening, can you describe the final project for folks?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the project's called Undesign the Redline. And so really the premise is that redlining is a key way in which really structurally racist policy inequality gets designed into cities, places, systems. And it's never been undone. Although we've said, redlining is illegal, I mean, it certainly still happens in many ways, but it's the legacy of it's still here, and we've never really undone the legacy. And so
Hmm.
that's kind of where we start from. And with redlining, not only because it's an enormously consequential policy and practice from the federal policy down to local banks and all kinds of actors, um, but because it's also such a accessible visual way for people to enter into this conversation.
Yeah.
Um, it's very simple. The original Hulk maps are very simple. They have four colors, and they zone out different neighborhoods. And then right there in the area descriptions is language like hazardous infiltration, Negro infiltration,
Yeah.
basically saying they're hazardous people in America, and we need to know where are they infiltrating, they'll say, or where are they invading. And that becomes synonymous with real estate values, access to loans, bank branch locations, insurance rates, right? So you immediately start to understand how we produced a geography of inequality in America through that visual maps. And one of the interesting things about that as a visualization is, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was definitely the most impactful redliners from the federal standpoint. They did have their own maps. They're not the Hulk maps, which we are the most, iconic ones, simply
Yeah.
because those are the ones that we have. And I always say, they're the best visual example that we have of redlining. They're not
Right.
necessarily the most impactful, but that's okay. You still get what redlining is looking at these maps. And, just going back to this comment before about, how you tell a story is, there's a lot of back and forth in the research community about what the impact of Hulk actually was and what these
Hmm.
maps really were and what the FHA did. And that's a lot of granularity that is very interesting for us as researchers. But as a layperson who's just being introduced to it, it's sort of like, yes, this is a great visual example, and there are other things happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
here's what the overall idea is, because that I think that when you're communicating to the public, you really want to be like, okay, what's the real idea that I'm trying to say, and not to trip over myself with a lot of that. Even though one thing you'll notice about our exhibit is that there's a lot in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Almost
Right.
an overwhelming experience. It's almost designed to be a bit overwhelming because the history is overwhelming. But you can kind of go through the top line, you can go
Hmm.
through somewhere in the middle, and then you can get into the really fine text,
Yeah.
and people can engage in it in different ways that way.
It's interesting the way you describe it, because it's not just the content and the implications of that content, but also the way you engage with it, because it's these, I don't know what, like 6 foot high panels that are kind of
7.
they're not quite in the round. It's not quite like a total circle, but they're rounded, so you're sort of
Mhm.
immersed into the physical
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
And was that a conscious? Did that? Well, I guess two questions. Was that a conscious decision, and was that the design in the original exhibit, or did it evolve over time?
Well, I'll say that the exhibit is kind of arranged differently for different spaces all the time,
Oh, okay.
but, we fit it into all kinds of spaces as part of the intent. It can go as many places as we can bring it, but the scale of it was always important and always
Hmm.
there. The timeline is 14, 16 feet. It's bigger than you.
Yeah.
And I think that has always worked, not only because we want to deliver like a lot of granular information, and we literally fill that whole space,
Right.
but also uh, as a way to imprint on people kind of the scale of this history. And it's almost impossible for certainly spending even an hour with it to read everything, to see everything. um, but that's okay. The idea really is to pull back and say, look at this huge history, look at all
Hmm.
these different things that were happening, not only things that connected to redlining, because we go through urban renewal, we go through planned shrinkage, all these policies, mass incarceration, all these policies that kind of end up actually being part of the same web of responses, but also what people are pushing back. There
Hmm.
is a lot. I want to just say that right off the bat, that the stories of people having alternative visions, of changing this course of history, of organizing, all that is always there,
Hmm.
and anywhere we bring it around the country, because we do a process of localizing this history when we bring it somewhere new, and I can talk more about that, but
Yeah.
always there's so many local stories on both sides of the timeline, which is the bottom up and the top down.
Right. So I want to talk about that. There's sort of two pieces that I find particularly interesting. One is the localization, and I'm curious how you all do that work, and then also the physical interactivity that people are
Mm.
encouraged to do with the project. It is not, again, for those who haven't seen it, it is not just these 14-foot by 6-foot panels, across this big thing that you just read and stand there and then move on to the next thing. There is this participatory element to it. So, can you talk about that participatory piece, and then I am curious about how you work with communities or localities when you're
Yeah.
invited to bring it in.
Yeah. Yeah. The exhibit is really intentionally interactive because it's inviting people to tell their own personal stories. It's we ask like what's missing from the timeline, or is something you disagree with? Is there something that you think is really important that people don't know? Allow people to add that. There's a space to add that to the timeline and a couple other places in the exhibit. And that has been always one of the most fascinating parts of the exhibit, especially it fills up with people's comments and
Yeah.
stories. Um, and, and it could be something as simple as, I never knew this and I'm really shocked, to really in-depth personal stories that people share.
Mm.
And, um, and that's very intentional because yes, we have collected a lot of information here, but we're not just coming in to tell people the story and be like, that's it. It's actually there. Everyone shows up to the exhibit with something,
Mm.
something that they have that we don't know. I always say, I'm always learning, and this is a process of learning for me and for you, and we're learning together, and let's
Right.
learn about it together. And just that's really the ethos of the project in general. It's not to create a division between, quote unquote, expert and people, because people live this. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone has lived this, and whether they really even recognized it or not, necessarily, their lives have been touched by it. And so hopefully through the history and through the exhibit, we're able to kind of evoke that sense of, oh, wow, I can see myself. I can see my own family history, whether or not I was on one side of the red line or the other. Um, and start to tell those stories and start to put the pieces together for themselves.
Right. Has there been any participation from folks that you have that sort of like lit a light bulb for you and said we should incorporate some aspect of that back into the main exhibit?
We have actually done that a few
Yeah.
times where we have kind of re-edited the exhibit
Mm.
um, to include, like we'll go through cards and include things. We have done that, occasionally for the kind of the national layer of the exhibit, and then there's a
Yeah.
localized layer, and we've done that. And also with the last section of the exhibit, section 5, is we just call the undesign section, which is kind of ideas of what to do.
Yeah.
And that section we kind of totally rearranged based on these kind of inputs that we were getting from people on kind of ideas and what they were sharing. Um, and so, that's always a dynamic and living part of it. I would love to do more of that. I wish that we
Yeah.
could do it all the
Yeah.
time, because it's, it is really dynamic. But, we like to, get that both in terms of writing, and now we're doing some more with recording people's stories and getting
Hmm.
video and audio and that kind of thing. And it's a life's work, even down to the level of a block locally, to tell
Right.
that story.
Right. Do you have is there a big closet somewhere with people everybody's like written comments that you all save?
Well, there are many closets because we like to let folks who are local hosts hold on to all of that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, and I can talk a little bit. We're invited to bring it. We're always just, someone invites us to bring the exhibit.
Yeah.
We work with them to get resources together, and we also um, bring together a community advisor group
Mm.
around the exhibit, and those could be just neighbors who've lived the history. We've had elected officials, certainly researchers and others, community organizers, people working in this space, to say, yeah, what are the local stories and local history that we want to see reflected in this exhibit? I always say it's just example stories, because
Hmm. Yeah.
telling them all is impossible in this short, project. But it's really finding examples, either, one from each neighborhood, or sometimes we base it around a theme. and we just talk for months. We meet and talk through the history, talk through the local stories, and really think about the question of what happened. How
Mm,
did this place become this place?
mm.
And what stories rise to the surface that really explain that story and bring us from the past to the present. We always try and think about even things like the redlining maps. They're not an artifact of the past. They really bring us to where we are now. And so when we look through the history together, that's the conversation that we have.
And when a locality, let's say a community center or a library, calls you up and says we are interested in hosting this exhibit in our space, when you start engaging with them, is that part of the initial discussion where you say we don't just ship this over to you and just install it and then we walk away, that there is this entire process that precedes the actual exhibition itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very much so a part of what we do. Now, we've done pop-ups of it where we just bring it and we pop it up.
Yeah.
Sure, but really when the real project is actually everything that comes before, during, and after, because we bring that group together. And one, it's a lot for any group to take on in many ways because it's, I mean, I always say it's a little bit choose your own adventure, because we've had some groups just bring the exhibit and have let people engage with it, and that's been very successful. And then we've had others who really bring bells and whistles to it, and they do a bunch of programming. And
Mm.
with our community advisor group, oftentimes it involves different organizations, and they might say, we're going to do a panel talk or a movie night, or we're going to do a tour of the neighborhood. And they use it as a platform. And part of the reason why we, not only to collect the research and to collect the stories, but also really to build relationships around the exhibit
Yeah.
and leverage it in a way that people start organizing with the exhibit and really
Hmm.
take it on as their own. And so for that reason, it has a life of its own in every place. It's not just ours. It's really the we. When we say we're designing the we, right, is they are the we as well.
Right.
And that's been the success of the project, because we've seen so much come out of this exhibit in every place. It really, as I said, it has a life of its own.
Yeah.
And there's been very intentional campaigns using the exhibit. There's been really things that emerged that no one expected, um, from really small stuff to really big stuff.
And so I'm curious about the physical nature of it. I mean, we're in a kind of digital first world. I can imagine any data visualization, storytelling, news organization, any sort of firm like that saying, and many have, we're going to tell the story of redlining, and it's going to be this big scrolly telling piece, and
Yeah.
maybe there's some comments and stuff like that. Did you ever, when you were first starting out, did you have those discussions about we could do this big digital piece, but we want to do this physical, interactive, in person?
Well, I always say, like, we want to do high touch, not just high tech.
Yeah.
And the physicality of the exhibit helps, one, bring people around it,
Mm.
physically bring people around it, and kind of it becomes an event. It's like something that's happening in time and place, space, like that type of programming that I was mentioning that people have done, where they bring together people to have panels, they bring together doing events.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do that at any time, right? But having the physicality of the exhibit, it kind of becomes a gathering point and a
Yeah.
platform in a way that it wouldn't be if it wasn't physical. And it's sort of like something that's there that people can go see. Now, I will tell you that we are at the end stages right now of also developing a companion web app
Hmm.
for this exhibit, which is very exciting and I'm really happy about, because it's going to allow people, for example, to interact in whole new ways. Like, they can go in their neighborhood and take a video of a lot and say, here's what used to be here, right? And
Yeah.
that can show up in the exhibit in a whole new way. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
But that being said, I always think of it as a companion in a way, because it it feeds in. The both of these things can feed into each other. I wouldn't
Sure.
say, I don't want to say that one is better, than the other necessarily, but I think that we've lost a little bit this idea that the physicality of an object in space that people can go to and gather around, and then be in the same space with each other experiencing it. Um,
Yes.
it can't be replicated online.
No, I think that's right. And then there are people where the exhibit doesn't come to their town or city or
Mm.
wherever they live, and so now they would have that opportunity to interact with it, which is really exciting. Um, I think there are probably lots of people. Well, I hope there's lots of people listening to this who are on that digital first side and hearing you and saying, I could imagine my project working in a similar way in a physical space. And I'm
Mm.
curious about the building and the fabrication of it. I mean, you and I have talked before, and
Yeah.
you've told me how it's not like it's not like building a rocket ship, right? You don't need a
Yeah.
huge amount of this. But can you talk a little bit about not just what the fabrication is, but what led to those decisions to have it built in such a way where, yeah, you could show up in Little Town Library of Little Town such and such, and they could have it in their lobby.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, it started off that way because we didn't have any money. So we bootstrapped the project at the
Yeah.
beginning, and you know, it had to be. We made it ourselves,
Mm.
literally, and now we more or less manufacture it at a print shop, but it's such that most print shops in any given city can produce it.
Mm.
They have to order the material. We print it on a honeycomb type cardboard, uh, and it's very rigid. It's very lightweight. It's easy. One person can move. There's 7 foot big boards, but you can carry it around if you need to.
Yeah.
And they're such that we can produce them. Now, I mean, it costs money certainly, but
Sure.
it's not this huge bells and whistles exhibit. I mean, in some ways, we can create a bells and whistles exhibit that can go in a major museum, but this is a project that it's been in church basements and community centers, and it's also been in city halls, and it's very beautiful, and it
Yeah.
is and it looks great. It's just that we try our best to make it at least somewhat accessible.
Right.
And I think that that's been one of the reasons why it's been as successful as it is. It's not like you have to put multiple 6 figures down to get it in there,
Right.
which
Right.
a lot of exhibits are that and more.
Yeah.
This is a little bit more of an organizing tool, and that's kind of how we've always wanted it to be. Is
Mm-hmm.
it's an organizing tool. It's meant to get people organized and get people activated.
Mm.
And in order to do that, it needed to go in a lot of different places.
Yeah. So you have this combination of research and design, and construction, I guess. But I'm sure there are also people listening to this who are on the research side of the world, and they're probably doing interesting work and thinking like, I would love to bring my project to people, right?
Yeah.
Bring it to life. And so if you were giving advice to a researcher who had an interesting project and they wanted to say, I want to do something similar to bring this project to life in a real space, like what would your recommendations be, or suggestions be for folks to think in that kind of way?
Well, I mean, for one, I think that they should work with someone with a design background and
Sure.
a storytelling background, and kind of, it's okay not to have those skills, but for example, we know how to work Adobe
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
graphic design programs, and that is this whole technical skill set that's
Yeah.
if you're focused elsewhere, it's a difficult one to learn. So I do think there is some of that. I think that what the key piece to get to nail with your research is to say, why does this matter to people? How has this affected and changed their life? And start from there and work your way back down into the details. And tell a story that you can really feel like you can back up, and then prioritize the story. So, you can always back it up, but like you don't let too much, get in the way of really telling a compelling story. And that can be that can be really hard to do, especially if you're in the weeds on research where you've spent a lot, years looking through it. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I mean, I literally will try and tell it. I love to talk about it with family or friends or people that are not engaged in it at all, and just try and quickly tell them what it is that we're
Yeah.
doing. And that's, if you've ever, I'm sure many listeners have tried to do that and failed. And that's always when you learn, okay, I really need to figure out what it is I'm trying to say. Um, and there's a lot of methodology behind that, and people that will help you do that.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to ask was on the kind of the qualitative community building side, because I think there are a lot of people. I mean, I at least especially early in my career put myself in this bucket of a more quantitative researcher,
Mhm.
right? And it's really easy to like look at the Hulk maps and grab the census
Right.
tract data and just go through and analyze it. And so for people who are more in that quantitative nature, like what would, but want to be more involved with communities and do something like this, like what would your recommendation be to like build these, as you mentioned, build these relationships with communities and community groups and and build a community advisory board and those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think you have to find the right partners. So, we're invited, and then we've often like brought people together um, with that, with a core partner, with a number of partners who have, that those relationships. And
Mm-hmm.
really, we think about how do we help them build their relationships with the community, with each other, um, and and focus on the relationships themselves. And then usually the content comes out of that.
Mm.
We, a lot of the research that we're doing is historic in nature. Looking at the history, what happened, what are the policies, what are the decisions, what are the events, as much as data, and sort of the kind of taking the temperature of what happened, where things are now, or looking at the evolution of that information over time. But a lot of the time, some of the most interesting things that have come out of it is kind of the putting some pieces together to be like, oh wow, this is a bigger story than we thought it was. And an example of that, we were in Winston-Salem, and we were looking at the era in the early 70s in Winston-Salem, which was the era of desegregation there. And although on a lot of the narrative obviously that we would tell and ought to tell about desegregation of it being a positive thing, the powers that be in Winston-Salem at the time were the same segregationists
Mm-hmm.
that had been running the town for a long time, and they were the ones running desegregation. And one of the ways that they approached that was really to dismantle Black institutions. For example, there was a Black hospital and a white hospital in Winston-Salem, and guess which one they closed and said, yeah, now, we close the Black hospital and say, now you can go to the white hospital. Isn't that great? But there was hundreds of Black doctors, Black pharmacists, Black
Yeah.
nurses, right? This was a huge anchor institution for that neighborhood that was helping fuel the economic and social life of that neighborhood. And it wasn't, oh, white folks are now going to start going and patronizing that hospital.
Yeah.
No, that's not what happened. Similarly, they did this with high schools. They did this with a busing company. There were two busing, there was a Black busing and a white busing, and they merged them, but they really just dissolved the Black busing company, which was one of the most successful in the country. So what we started to piece together was actually that, in a sense, the era of desegregation was sort of weaponized against the Black community by a lot of the powers that be. And that bigger narrative suddenly was an aha moment. It was taking these individual stories. One person might be researching health and hospitals, one of the busing, et cetera, and starting to zoom out and say, wow, look what happened. And then you see the impact that that had in combination with things like redlining, urban renewal, cutting of public services to Black neighborhoods in Winston-Salem was really devastating.
Mm.
And but that was like a new narrative that came out of looking at all the research together,
Right.
to really say, wait a minute, this moment that we sort of celebrate was actually a moment that a lot of the crises that were coming out of redlining were retrenched and
Yeah.
yeah.
Huh. Um, So it's a really interesting project. Braden, I appreciate you coming on the show. I want to ask, how can people find you and your team? What does it take, not financially, but what does it take to sort of invite you all to come out and open the exhibit for folks that are like, hey, we should have these folks in our library or in our building or wherever?
Well, for one, I'll say we really think it should go everywhere. So reach out. We we just reach out to us. We have designingthewe.com. I'm Braden at designingthewe.com. And I'm happy to have a conversation. It always just starts with folks reaching out and we have a conversation we put the pieces together, and can be a process, and sometimes it happens quickly and sometimes slowly, and we'll work with you to make it happen. We've done it so many times. This project is nearing 10 years old.
Oh, wow.
So it's been to over 24 cities. We pretty much know how to work it out, so we can help you do that.
Yeah.
And there's always something new, but that's why we're always on the learning curve. But just reach out. I mean, and we're happy to connect you with people who have done it, to hear from them, anything like that. There's a whole network of people out there.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific. And I'm looking forward to the digital version as well, and to play around with that. And this is great. So thanks so much for coming on the show. Great to chat again. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you will take a look at the project on the Design the We website. Reach out to Braden if you have questions, comments, or even better yet, want to bring the exhibit to your town or to your area. And once again, please rate or review the show wherever you are listening to it. Or if you're watching it on YouTube, be sure to click that thumbs up button. Subscribe to my channel for all stuff around data and data visualization. All right. Until next time, this has been the PolicyViz Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.